Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. As I've been mentioning in the last couple of episodes, there's an assumption at the heart of our thinking, I think, in the modern West, that not only blocks us from living the kind of life we desire, but is also really kind of a grave threat to us both individually and communally. And today I'd like to talk in more detail about what that assumption is and where it comes from. Because knowing these things, I think, is really the only way we can free ourselves from it. We've seen this assumption surface in some striking examples of modern takes on Plato, specifically, of course, these passages in which Bertrand Russell and Rebecca Goldstein, both in their own ways, fault Plato for, in their view, never really having figured out a way to reconcile the rational and irrational, or perhaps better put, the apparently irrational, in human nature. I say striking because, to my mind, the synthesis or reconciliation of these two elements of psychic life is precisely Plato's great gift to us. Last time I talked a bit about Plato's resolution of this problem of human self-dividedness, which of course is also the overarching theme of this whole series. But out of this question, the question then naturally arises, how or why is it that so many of us in the modern West could have missed this about Plato? And that question is what I'm going to tackle today. Russell and Goldstein were or are really pretty mainstream in Anglo-American philosophy, and the warm reception they have received and their relatively wide influence suggest to me that this missing of Plato is in a way kind of systemic or endemic in our time. I think it is, and its origins actually go back hundreds of years. I think Plato himself, in what you could call kind of prophetic way, maybe, gives us a hint of what has happened in the very same passage of the Phaedrus we've been talking about. It's right after Socrates explains to Phaedrus that some forms of madness, the Greek word is mania, he's talking about unitive, or you could say apparently irrational states. Some forms of them, he says, are good because they're sent to us from the gods. And then he announces he's going to give a proof of this. But, he adds, it will be a proof that convinces the wise, if not the clever. And by the way, the Greek word translated as clever here is interesting. It's deinos, and whether you know it or not, you've come across it before. We see it in the Greek, in the word dinosaur, for example, and in this case it means frightening. Dinosaur being Greek, of course, for frightening lizard. But it can also speak to a marvelous or strange power, something sometimes in the case of mental ability. Homer uses it, for example, to describe Odysseus's impressive power of clever speech. So Socrates talks about, quote, a proof that convinces the wise, if not the clever. Excuse me. There's something about what he's about to say that may not have the same effect on both. And so there's a difference between wisdom and cleverness that he seems to be hinting at here. But what is that difference, actually? I'm not sure if this is a question that's easily answerable today, for a simple reason. I'm not sure that we really even believe there's a difference between cleverness and wisdom anymore, at least not in the public sphere. I mean, basically, wisdom is something we don't really believe in anymore. There's a tendency, of course, for things to be explained through natural science by default, and therefore for decisions to be made based on data alone. And so what we've seen, I think, is not just the death of God, as Nietzsche so famously observed, but the death of wisdom. I'm reminded in this of these words from a Lou Reed song. You can't depend on no wise men. You can't find them because they're not there. And so I think for many of us, it's a bit of a challenge to be open to the idea that there might be something called wisdom. It seems a bit uncertain what it might be, and that maybe even any kind of cognition other than the processing of data must be purely subjective, a kind of cognition that people in previous ages, in their ignorance, deluded themselves into giving authority to. But I think even today, we can open ourselves up to the possibility that wisdom exists, that basically there's a higher, by which I mean more authoritative, form of cognition than the processing of data. And actually, when we do this, when we open ourselves up to this possibility, I think we enrich our lives in a way we might not even have thought possible. I think we can at least concede that some sort of difference seems to be implied between wisdom and cleverness. So what is it exactly? The clever seem impressive, sometimes frighteningly so, but when compared to the wise, seem to be missing something. I'm going to go out on a limb here and venture that that something is actually two things, in a way: a knowledge of the good and a knowledge of the one. Although, as we saw for Plato, this is actually just one thing. Here's why I say this. If we try to get what we mean or what we once meant when we spoke of wisdom, if we try to get to that, I think what we come to first is this idea not only of knowledge, but more importantly, an ability to discern what to do with knowledge, to understand, in other words, the significance of it. But the significance of it is, of course, the good of it. And so wisdom must have meant in some way a knowledge of the good. Secondly, wisdom must be, in a sense, knowledge of unity. It is knowledge in context, in oneness with the whole. The kind of knowledge that could aid in discernment has to know not only the good, but the whole. The wise see the whole picture, not just trees, but the forest. And then there's sort of a third point here, which is, of course, that in a sense, in wisdom, these two kinds of knowledge of the good and the one come together, because it's only in this seeing of the whole that the significance, the good of something appears to us. I think thinking about wisdom actually takes us back to this Platonic idea of the identity of these two, and the idea of there being principles, that the knowledge of them is what's most important and what ought to be most authoritative. Now, the tricky thing, I think, for us in the modern world is that there will always be something unspoken and unspeakable about this kind of knowledge. As we've seen, this cognition of the good or one ultimately must be immediate, not through the medium of abstract thought. If the good is the one, then it, and the cognition of it also, must be beyond the subject-object divide. There's necessarily an element of the unitive in wisdom, since it deals with what is not really accessible to abstract thought. And I think that's really a difficult, and it can't be other than subversive idea for our time. So why is that? Why don't we believe in wisdom anymore? I think a defining characteristic of modern thought is this assumption, the roots of which go back to the late Middle Ages, I think, that there's only objective and subjective cognition. There's no third way. We see this suggested, I think, in medieval philosophy after Thomas Aquinas, because whereas Aquinas had tried to harmonize faith and reason, subsequent generations of philosophers, like Scotus and Occam, for example, gradually and increasingly pushed faith, or the intuitive, you might say, to the individual and subjective, which of course made the Protestant Reformation, this virtually infinite fragmentation of Christianity into competing sects, more or less inevitable. And then meanwhile, in the Renaissance, we see this new awareness of history, of historical progress, this sense of humanity finding itself in a new age in which humans might be masters of nature. And these things kind of come together, I think, in Descartes, who sees the key to human mastery as the development of a method of thinking based on clear and distinct ideas, pure abstraction in which intuition, or what I've been calling immediate cognition, unitive cognition, plays no part. That's what makes them clear and distinct. There's a sense that what is not clear and distinct must be arbitrary and subjective. And so, since Descartes, philosophers have been seeking above all to know how we can be certain of our knowledge. And in this search, the unspoken is taken to have no part. And then I think this approach really comes to a head in one of the foundational documents of the Anglo-American philosophical tradition, the 1922 Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus of Russell's friend at Cambridge, Ludwig Wittgenstein. In that work, Wittgenstein, on the one hand, acknowledges the existence of the mystical. However, he continues, the mystical is only a feeling, and therefore inexpressible, and therefore outside the realm of philosophy. And we may remember that Freud had said something pretty similar about it, actually. Wittgenstein, and a similar, remarkably similar time in history, Wittgenstein said, the feeling of the world as a limited whole is the mystical feeling. And then a little later in the same work, there is indeed the inexpressible. This shows itself. It is the mystical. But there's room in philosophy only for what can be expressed, if I can put Wittgenstein in Cartesian terms, in clear and distinct ideas. Wittgenstein writes, the right method of philosophy would be this, to say nothing except what can be said. And his work famously concludes, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Of course, there's an obvious appeal, as Goldstein told us last time, of what she called this exclusion of privileged points of view, ones that come out of these ecstatic or unitive states, rather than what you could call separated states, when the part of us that reasons sort of declares its independence from our feelings, separates itself from them, and strives to move along independently of them by means of these clear and distinct ideas. Abstractions are universals, after all, and surely what's true must be true universally. There's something that seems fundamentally democratic about this kind of thinking. And then moreover, as Goldstein points out, the lending of credence to the ideas that seem to emerge from these unitive states is undoubtedly dangerous. The Reformation led to bloody wars of religion, and the craving for unity that has surfaced politically in the last century or so as totalitarianism has resulted, of course, in the greatest evils of our time. The problem, though, is that once philosophy divests itself of the unitive and the good, its aim becomes much narrower. From being the solution of this fundamental and universal human problem of self-division, its scope narrows to a mere knowledge of objects, its goal to attain not oneness for the self of the self with the cosmos, but rather certainty of our knowledge of ourselves and the cosmos in order to master them as things that are set off from us, in a way opposed to us. Things really that we can manipulate. And it's sort of the conviction of this series that we have that although this is something we value very much, we also have another desire that in a way is deeper, for oneness with the other. And so you'll notice Russell, in the passage we cited last time, seems to assume philosophy is about knowing, in his words, the secret of the universe, while Goldstein assumes it's about, quote, seeking to know the world, unquote. It's sort of about knowing the other as other. But if philosophy can't help us with this universal problem of our self-dividedness, what can? It seems all we have left then are these various irrational and therefore ultimately illusory forms of unification. This is perhaps the great problem of our time, as I'm fond of repeating in this series. As I've said a few times, we find ourselves in this modern era in many ways a prey to our craving, largely unconscious, I think, for oneness and direction, for the one and the good. We seek them in all sorts of ways. Many of these ways are harmful, both individually and communally, and lead only to more dividedness. Getting back to Odysseus's strange and marvelous cleverness, let's remember that there's something of the tragic hero about Homer's Odysseus. There's a self-dividedness about him. Only at the very end is he able to reconcile with Poseidon, with the power underneath, this massive and mysterious vitality that lies under the surface. And I think that is really the true homecoming of Odysseus. So what's the solution? How do we actually answer the criticism of Goldstein and others of this unitive thinking in Plato? Is there a false assumption we can point out in the thinking of the modern West that can free us from a philosophizing that, while necessary and desirable in so many ways, is also too narrow to solve the fundamental human problem? I think there is, and I kind of hinted at it, I think, in the last episode, without making it quite as clear as maybe I would have liked. The point, I think, that has been missed, maybe, for centuries in the West, is that there's a third kind of cognition beyond the objective and the subjective. There's something that transcends these two. I think what has happened is that the critics of these unitive states, those who dismiss them as merely subjective, have confused two things. They've confused the cognition that occurs in these states, that fleeting, maybe even split-second immediate cognition, with the conclusions we draw from them. Now, subjectivity, I think, is a notoriously hard thing to define, but to my mind, and I think I'll be explaining this in later episodes, in these moments of immediacy, there's neither subject nor object, and so there can be no subjectivity. The subjectivity, I think, comes in the moment after, when we try to make sense of what we've experienced, when we try to translate it into abstractions. There's a difference between the unitive cognition that is occurring during these states and the articulated conclusions one takes away from them. Subjectivity, I think, belongs to the latter, and that latter is where error creeps in. And so it seems that if philosophy is to tackle the fundamental and universal problem of self-division, then the unspeakable, the unitive, must play a role in it, must shape it somehow. Otherwise, it can deal only with inner and outer worlds that are seen as set against us. Yet, on the other hand, philosophy must recognize that these unitive moments hold potential for not only great good, but great evil as well. It all depends on how we bring them across to the reasoning mind, on what abstract thoughts we bring from them. And so a key role of philosophy must then be to somehow ensure we do this truthfully. And that's actually what a big focus of the rest of this series will be. I think it's a big concern of Plato. To put it in plain language, how should we make sense of our feelings? In the meantime, you may be wondering something. What happened to this question I mentioned several episodes ago? Why would Diotima the prophetess say in the Symposium that all desire is for nothing but the good, when that doesn't seem to be what we see? I think this question is actually quite closely related to the question I just mentioned about making sense of our feelings, and it's what we'll be talking about in the next several episodes. I hope you can join me then, and until then, be well, and thanks for watching.